Birmingham calls itself the Second City. For these men, it was a hunting ground, a city where a MAC-10 opened fire on two teenage girls at a New Year's party, where heroin arrived from Lahore, hidden inside industrial lathes, and where one gangster faced 3 separate murder trials before a conviction finally stuck. These are the crimes of Birmingham's most notorious gangsters. Section 1. Handsworth and the birth of Birmingham's gang war. At the top of Soho Road in Handsworth, 2 miles northwest of Birmingham city centre, a burger bar sat on a corner. A fish bar called Johnson's stood nearby. By the end of the 1980s, the young men who had gathered at each of those 2 places had given Birmingham's gang war its 2 principal actors, and the city's criminal landscape a shape it would not escape for decades. Handsworth in the 1980s was one of the most pressured urban communities in Britain. The area had absorbed wave after wave of post-war immigration from the Caribbean, primarily from Jamaica and Barbados, beginning in the late 1940s, and later from India and Pakistan. By the mid-1980s, it held one of the largest black communities in England outside London, concentrated into streets of Victorian terraced housing along the Soho Road and the Lozells Road, into tower blocks built in the post-war years, into a district that had been steadily losing the manufacturing jobs that had drawn its residents there in the first place. Unemployment in Handsworth by 1985 was among the highest in the entire West Midlands. The relationship between the community and West Midlands police had been adversarial for years, shaped by the aggressive use of stop-and-search powers against young black men and by a pattern of interactions that left deep grievances on both sides. That relationship broke apart twice in the space of 4 years. In 1981, Handsworth saw serious disorder as part of a wave of riots that swept through British cities that summer. In September 1985, it erupted again. The second riot began in Lozells and spread into Handsworth, lasting for 3 days. Shops were looted and burned. Dozens of properties were destroyed. 2 brothers, Kasamali and Amirali Moladina, died in their post office on the Lozells Road when it was set on fire. 35 people were injured. More than 1,500 police officers were deployed across the affected area. What followed the riots was not recovery in any real sense. The underlying conditions remained. The jobs did not return. The tensions between the community and the police did not resolve. Into that persistent pressure, the structures that would define Birmingham's gang war began to take shape. The young men who gathered at the burger bar on Soho Road were not, at the beginning, a gang in any organised meaning of the word. They were a grouping of individuals with shared geography, shared frustrations, and shared time. The same was true of those who gathered at Johnson's nearby. For a period, the 2 groups were not in conflict. They knew each other. Some accounts suggest they were broadly friendly. The origins of the falling out between them are genuinely contested. Several versions circulate in the documentary record and in court testimony gathered across the following 2 decades. Some place the original cause as a dispute between 2 individuals over a woman. Others describe a financial grievance, a debt that was not paid, an insult that was not absorbed. One version, repeated across multiple sources, frames it as something so small that even those present struggle to reconstruct it with certainty. What can be established from the evidence that later became public is that by the end of the 1980s, the split was real, the identities were fixed, and the territory was divided. The Burger Bar Boys, the Johnson Crew, 2 names, 2 postcodes, 1 city. The territorial boundary that emerged from this division had a specific geography that would shape the conflict for the next 20 years. The Burger Bar Boys claimed the B21 postcode, covering Handsworth and reaching westward into Smethwick. They were assessed consistently by West Midlands Police Intelligence as the more financially organised of the 2 groups, with better supply connections, stronger internal discipline, and eventually a more extensive and reliable arsenal of weapons. The Johnson Crew, sometimes called the Johnnies, held the B6 postcodes, Lozells and Aston, to the east and south. Their structure was more diffuse. They had more members and a looser hierarchy, with splinter factions that operated semi-independently. One of those factions went by the name the Cash Money Crew. Another grouping, sometimes called the Raiders, was connected enough to the main group to count as part of its network, but operated with a degree of autonomy that made prosecution difficult. Both gangs built themselves around the drug trade. Heroin and cocaine were the main commodities in the late 1980s. Crack cocaine arrived in significant quantities in the early 1990s. The economics of this trade were straightforward in their logic. even as they were complex in their execution. A gang that controlled a specific area, a set of streets, a housing estate, a cluster of corners, could operate a distribution network within that area and collect income from it. The size of that income depended on the size and exclusivity of the territory. More territory meant more income. Contested territory meant uncertainty and cost. The most efficient position was the one in which you controlled your area completely and your nearest competitors knew it. That knowledge had to be communicated somehow. In a legitimate market, it is communicated through law, through contracts, through courts that enforce boundaries. In a criminal drug market, it is communicated through the willingness to respond to incursion with force. This is not an expression of chaos. It is an expression of the only enforcement mechanism available. Street dealing in Handsworth during this period worked through layers. At the top, individuals with capital and connections sourced product from wholesale suppliers. Those suppliers were connected to importers operating at a level further removed from the street. Product was stepped on, mixed with cutting agents to increase volume and reduce purity, and moved outward through a network of dealers who operated specific areas. The men at the top of both gangs understood this structure and built their operations accordingly. Distance from the street-level act of supply protected them. The closer you were to the actual handover of drugs to a user, the greater your exposure to arrest. The further back you were, the safer you were, and the more money you made relative to your risk. This is why the leaders of both groups were rarely the ones holding the drugs when police arrived. By the early 1990s, something entered the Handsworth drug market that changed its terms sharply. Yardie gangsters from Jamaica had been moving into British cities since the late 1980s, establishing first in London and then expanding outward. Birmingham was a natural target. It had an established Jamaican community in Handsworth that provided both a customer base and a degree of cover. It had drug markets that were generating significant revenue. And it had a local criminal population that was experienced in street dealing but had not yet fully adapted to the level of violence that the incoming operators were prepared to use. The Yardies brought firearms and a culture shaped by the garrison communities of Kingston, environments in which lethal violence was a routine part of commercial and territorial dispute. They moved into the Handsworth market with a directness that demanded a direct response. Police and journalists who covered this period noted that the killings began in the final days of 1995. Both the Burger Bar Boys and the Johnson crew, for once aligned against a common external threat, drove the Yardie operators out of Handsworth or reduced them to a marginal presence. The conflict was brutal and quick, by the standards of what had come before. It involved shootings on streets, retaliations, and a level of firearms use that neither gang had previously sustained. What the two Birmingham groups gained from this period, beyond the removal of the Yardie threat, was something harder to quantify and far more consequential. They learned that firearms could be used effectively. They acquired more of them in the course of the conflict. They emerged from it with a culture of gun violence that had not fully existed before, and they pointed that culture at each other. Through the mid and late 1990s, the shooting incidents between the Burger Bar Boys and the Johnson crew became a regular feature of life across Handsworth, Lozells and Aston. Nightclub car parks were frequent sites of confrontation. Community centres saw shootings. The Handsworth Carnival, one of the city's most significant annual cultural events, became a recurring flashpoint at which gang tensions broke into open violence year after year. West Midlands police logged shooting after shooting, building an intelligence picture that was comprehensive in detail but consistently difficult to turn into convictions that reached above the operational level. Witnesses would not come forward. Victims frequently refused to cooperate. The culture of silence that surrounded both gangs was not incidental to their survival. It was central to it. The leadership structures of both groups during this period operated almost entirely through street names and personal reputation, rather than through any formal hierarchy that could be documented. The Burger Bar Boys had a figure referred to, in intelligence files and in later court proceedings, as the Godfather, a man whose real identity was sufficiently protected that prosecutions involving him were limited for years. Other names that circulated, heard by police and community workers and by rivals on the other side: S1, Little D, Charmer, Honey Monster. These were the individuals who moved product, managed money, gave instructions, and ensured that the gang's operational capacity was maintained across changes in membership caused by imprisonment, injury, and death. On the Johnson crew side, Arthur Ellis, whose street name was Super D, was a founding figure of real significance. He was a man whose own family would later become entangled in the feud in a way that no account of this period can ignore. The deliberate informality of both gangs served a specific legal function. There were no written records, no formal meetings, no documentation of any kind that could be seized and used to build a conspiracy case reaching upward through the structure. Instructions moved through personal relationships. Knowledge was held inside heads rather than on paper. The closer you were to the center of the operation, the more you knew and the less of it existed anywhere that a search warrant could reach. West Midlands police officers who worked this intelligence beat through the 1990s described a consistent problem. They could see what was happening. They could see the drug dealing, the shootings, the territorial enforcement. Building a case that attributed the direction of these activities to specific senior figures was another matter entirely. By the early 2000s, Birmingham's gang problem had reached a scale that forced a significant institutional response. West Midlands Police estimated that 40 local criminal gangs were involved in active turf warfare across the city. The force's organised crime unit was compelled to double its manpower to handle the volume of firearms incidents. The year 2003 would later be looked back on as the worst of a bad stretch. In that year alone, City Hospital treated 142 victims of gun crime. There were periods during which police were responding to as many as 6 separate shooting incidents within a single day. The men being shot were mostly connected to one gang or another, but not always. The geography of the conflict was spread across dense residential streets, and that meant that proximity to it was not a matter of choice for everyone who lived there. In December 2002, Johann Martin was killed. Martin went by the street name 13 and was a significant figure within the Burger Bar Boys. His death was attributed by the gang to the Johnson crew. Martin had a brother, Nathan, who went by the name 23, and who was a Burger Bar member of his own standing. Nathan Martin processed his brother's death through the logic of the world both of them had grown up in. That logic pointed in one direction. In the last days of December 2002, a red Ford Mondeo was purchased by members of the Burger Bar Boys. On the evening of January 1st, 2003, a group of them drove it toward Birchfield Road in Aston, where a Johnson crew member was believed to be attending a New Year's party at a hair salon. They were planning a revenge killing. They were not precise about who they hit. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Next up, we turn to Birchfield Road on the night of January 2nd, 2003, and the 4 men who fired a MAC-10 into a crowd of girls leaving a party, and the life sentences that followed. Section 2. Birchfield Road. In the early hours of January 2nd, 2003, a New Year's party was winding down at a hair salon on Birchfield Road in Aston. 2 young women had stepped outside. A car slowed on the road beside them, and a MAC-10 machine pistol opened fire. Charlene Ellis was 18 years old. Letitia Shakespeare was 17. They were best friends, described by everyone who knew them as ordinary young women with no connection to either of Birmingham's warring gangs. Charlene was a twin. Her sister Sophie was at the party with her that night. Their cousin Cheryl Shaw was there too, and a friend named Leon Harris. The party itself was a private gathering, the kind of celebration common enough on New Year's in Aston, held on the upper floor of the salon. The young women had come outside for a reason as unremarkable as getting some air. They were standing on the pavement when the shooting began. What happened to Charlene and Letitia has to be understood within the sequence of events that immediately preceded it, because the attack was not directed at them. It was directed at a group of young men standing nearby who were believed to include a member of the Johnson crew. The distinction matters enormously as a legal and moral fact, but it did not alter what the MAC-10 did when it fired. The weapon was a compact machine pistol capable of discharging rounds at an extremely high rate. In the hands of someone who used it on a group of people standing outside a building on a public road in the early hours of a January morning, it was not a precise instrument. Charlene Ellis and Letitia Shakespeare were hit multiple times and died. Sophie Ellis was struck and wounded seriously enough that she would later describe losing enormous amounts of blood and facing the prospect of being unable to walk again. Cheryl Shaw was shot in the hand. Leon Harris was also injured. Approximately 150 people were in or near the salon that night. Nearly all of them saw or heard what happened. Almost none of them would speak to the police. The planning that led to Birchfield Road had begun 3 days earlier. In late December 2002, Johann Martin, a Burger Bar Boys member who operated under the street name 13, was killed. Johann's brother Nathan, known within the gang as 23, was a burger bar member himself, and a man who had grown up inside the logic of a feud in which the appropriate response to the killing of your own was the killing of theirs. Nathan Martin believed the Johnson crew were responsible for his brother's death. Whether that belief was accurate is a separate question from whether he acted on it, and the evidence showed that he did. On the 31st of December, Nathan Martin and associates purchased a red Ford Mondeo. They were not buying a car because they needed transport. They were buying a vehicle that could not be traced to any of them, one that could be driven to a location, used and abandoned. Less than 48 hours after the Mondeo was bought, the four men who would be convicted of the Birchfield Road shootings drove through Aston in a Vauxhall Astra toward the hair salon on Birchfield Road. The red Mondeo appears in the planning. The Vauxhall Astra is the vehicle that made it to the scene. The details of exactly how the operation was assembled and which individual played which role were argued at length during the trial that followed. What the prosecution established, to the satisfaction of a jury, was that Marcus Ellis, 24 years old, drove the vehicle. Michael Gregory, 23, fired the MAC-10. Nathan Martin, 26, was involved in acquiring the weapon. Rodrigo Sims, 20, acted as a spotter, identifying the location and directing the group to it. Between them, they had carried out an operation intended to kill a Johnson crew member in retaliation for the death of Johann Martin. They killed 2 teenage girls instead. The investigation that West Midlands police launched in the days and weeks following the shootings confronted a problem that was both entirely predictable and deeply serious. 150 people had been at or near the scene. A fraction of that number gave statements. Of those who initially cooperated, some withdrew their cooperation as time passed, and as it became apparent that speaking to the police carried consequences in the world the gangs occupied. The Burger Bar boys had a reach that extended into the community around the crime scene, and the message that reached potential witnesses was not subtle. Sophie Ellis, who had watched her twin sister die and who had been shot herself, later described her family's car being attacked after the convictions, and of people she encountered in public spaces, making comments that made her feel the killer's loyalists saw her as the enemy. The pressure applied to the community around this investigation was sustained and purposeful. It was designed to ensure that anyone who had seen what happened on Birchfield Road weighed the consequences of saying so before deciding whether to speak. Given what West Midlands police were dealing with in terms of witness cooperation, and given the scale of the Birmingham gang presence in the city generally, a decision was taken to hold the trial outside Birmingham. Leicester Crown Court was selected. The rationale was straightforward. A jury drawn from Birmingham's population included people who lived in or near the affected communities and who might reasonably fear consequences from either gang if their verdict displeased the relevant parties. Moving the trial to Leicester put physical distance between the jury and the city's gang geography. It also made the logistics of any intimidation attempt more difficult. The trial began in late 2004 and ran for 4 months. The legal question that generated the most significant long-term consequence from the trial was not about the defendants themselves, but about a witness. Among those who had information about the Birchfield Road shooting was an individual who was prepared to give evidence, but who was not prepared to do so under his own name. He had a criminal history and connections to the gang world. He had reason to believe that being identified in open court as a prosecution witness would put his life at risk. The prosecution applied for permission to call him without disclosing his identity to the defense or to the public. The court granted it. The witness gave his evidence from behind a screen, with his voice distorted, identified in the proceedings only as Mark Brown. This was the first time in the legal history of England and Wales that a secret witness had been permitted to give evidence in a murder trial. The defense challenged it immediately, and continued challenging it for years afterward. The arguments against the use of secret witnesses are not trivial. The right to confront the evidence against you, to test the reliability of witnesses through cross-examination, to know who is saying what and why, is a foundational element of the right to a fair trial. Defense barristers argued throughout the proceedings and in every subsequent appeal that the anonymity granted to Mark Brown made it impossible to challenge his account properly, because his background, his motives, and his reliability could not be explored without knowing who he was. The prosecution countered that in a case where gang violence made open testimony genuinely dangerous, some accommodation had to be made. The jury heard both arguments. They convicted all 4 defendants. Marcus Ellis was found guilty of the murder of both girls and of the attempted murders of Sophie Ellis, Cheryl Shaw, and Leon Harris. Michael Gregory was convicted on the same counts. Nathan Martin was convicted of both murders and the 3 attempted murders. Rodrigo Sims was convicted of both murders and the attempted murders. The sentencing took place in March 2005. Mr. Justice Goldring, passing sentence, imposed life imprisonment on all 4 men. Ellis, Gregory and Martin were told they must serve a minimum of 35 years before they could be considered for parole. Sims, whose minimum term was reduced to reflect his age of 20 at the time of the offence, was given a minimum of 27 years. The combined minimum terms across all 4 men came to 132 years. One fact about Marcus Ellis and the specific nature of his conviction took a moment to absorb when it was understood fully. Charlene Ellis, one of the 2 young women killed on Birchfield Road, was his half-sister. Marcus Ellis had climbed into a car and driven it to a location where he helped position the group, from which a MAC-10 was fired into a crowd that included Charlene. The man convicted of her murder was her own brother. The 2 had the same father. Arthur Ellis, known as Super D, was a founding figure of the Johnson crew, which put him on the opposing side of the feud from his son, who was a burger bar member. The family therefore contained within it the essential structure of the conflict: father on one side, son on the other, and a daughter and sister caught between them on a pavement at 2 in the morning, who died without ever having chosen a side. The family of Marcus Ellis and the family of Rodrigo Sims maintained from early on that the convictions represented a miscarriage of justice. Solicitors representing the 2 men argued that Mark Brown, the anonymous witness, had invented evidence, and that without his testimony, there was no case. The men appealed at Woolwich Crown Court in 2005. The appeal was rejected. They applied to the House of Lords for leave to appeal further. That application was refused. In 2012, Ellis, Martin, and Sims brought their case to the European Court of Human Rights, arguing that the use of the anonymous witness had breached their right to a fair trial under the European Convention. The court considered the case carefully and rejected it. 7 judges found unanimously that the anonymity arrangement had not made the trial unfair. The convictions stood. Every avenue the convicted men pursued over the following years produced the same result. Letitia Shakespeare's mother, Marcia Shakespeare, responded to each successive appeal with a consistency that spoke to how exhausting the process had been for both families. She had lost her daughter at 17 to a botched gang operation directed at someone else entirely, and she had spent the years since watching the men convicted of it find new legal arguments to pursue. Her view, expressed publicly on multiple occasions, was that they were extending the suffering of the victims' families through a process they knew would not succeed. She established a charity in her daughter's name, the Precious Trust, and continued working in schools and with communities at risk of gang involvement. She was later appointed MBE for this work. Beverly Thomas, Charlene's mother, worked alongside her. Together, the 2 women became among the most prominent voices in Britain on the subject of gang violence and its consequences for families who had no part in it. The Aston shootings of January 2003 had a specific effect on the national understanding of what Birmingham's gang war had become. Before Birchfield Road, the violence between the Burger Bar Boys and the Johnson crew was known to West Midlands police, to the local community, and to those who followed regional crime reporting. After Birchfield Road, it was national news. The image of 2 teenage girls dead outside a hair salon on a New Year's morning, killed in a gang operation that was not even aimed at them, stripped away any ambiguity about the level of danger the feud had reached. It also made the feud itself more difficult to contain. The convictions in 2005 removed 4 men who had been active in the gang's operations, but the Burger Bar Boys remained a functioning organisation. New figures moved up within it. The rivalry with the Johnson crew continued. The weapons were still there. The territory was still there. The logic that had produced Birchfield Road had not been dismantled. Only 4 of the people operating within it had been locked away. The man who would come to represent the most enduring individual danger within the Burger Bar Boys through the decade and a half that followed the Aston shootings was not among the 4 convicted in 2005. He had already been connected to the gang for years before the Birchfield Road attack. He would be charged in connection with that night, and cleared. He would be tried for murder on separate occasions and cleared again. He would go on operating, visible within the gang world, until the weight of evidence finally caught him standing over a body outside a Birmingham snooker club in 2015. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Next up, we cover Tafarwa Beckford, the Burger Bar Boys member police described as iconic, who stood trial for 3 separate murders before a jury finally convicted him, and the 32-year minimum sentence that followed. Section 3. Tafarwa Beckford. In the early hours of October the 30th, 2015, a dispute inside the Big Bang Snooker Club on Soho Hill in Hockley escalated into gunfire on the street outside. Approximately 150 people were present in and around the venue. Within 60 seconds of the first shots, Derek Jr. Myers, 25 years old and a father of 2, was shot twice and died. The man who killed him was Tafarwa Beckford. Beckford was 36 at the time, a long-standing Burger Bar Boys member who operated under the street name Dreads, and who had spent the better part of 2 decades moving through the gang world of North and West Birmingham without a murder conviction attaching itself to him, despite the fact that police and prosecutors had twice previously tried to secure one. The killing of Derek Myers was the 3rd serious investigation in which Beckford featured as a suspect. It was the first one that put him in front of a jury who returned a guilty verdict. He would receive a life sentence with a minimum term of 32 years. Detective Chief Superintendent Mark Payne, head of CID for West Midlands Police, described it as one of the most significant convictions in Birmingham in the previous 20 years. It was the end of a story that had been building since the late 1990s. Tafarwa Beckford grew up in the Ladywood area of Birmingham, on Duchess Road, a street of terraced houses a short distance from the city centre, and well within the territories that both the Burger Bar Boys and the Johnson crew claimed and disputed through the 1990s and early 2000s. He was connected to the Burger Bar Boys from an early age, and by the beginning of the 2000s his name was appearing in police intelligence records in connection with some of the most serious incidents in the gang's history. In 2000, Beckford was charged with the murder of Chris Clark. Clark had been stabbed and beaten with champagne bottles. The case did not result in conviction. Beckford was cleared. The relationship between that acquittal and his subsequent behaviour is important to understand. For a man operating within the logic of the Burger Bar Boys, walking free from a murder charge was not simply a legal outcome. It was a demonstration of resilience, of the ability to move through the criminal justice system without being held by it. This kind of record accumulated into a reputation. Within the gang world, the person who has faced serious charges and emerged untouched is someone whose reach and resourcefulness are understood to be significant. It changes the way others position themselves around that person. It makes intimidating witnesses more straightforward because the message is already established. It is not a neutral event. It is a credential of a specific and dangerous kind. 3 years after the Clark acquittal, Beckford's name appeared again. The murders of Charlene Ellis and Letitia Shakespeare on Birchfield Road in January 2003 triggered the largest murder investigation West Midlands Police had mounted in years. 4 men were eventually convicted of those killings. Tafarwa Beckford was among those charged in connection with the events of that night. He was not among the 4 who stood trial in Leicester. Proceedings against him were halted partway through, following a submission that there was insufficient evidence to put the case to a jury. He was cleared. 2 serious cases, 2 acquittals. His standing within the Burger Bar Boys, already significant, continued to grow. What Beckford represented inside the gang by the mid-2000s was something specific and difficult for law enforcement to address cleanly. He was an experienced operational figure who understood how investigations worked and what they needed to succeed. He had watched prosecutions run up against the wall of witness silence and collapse. He understood that distance from the physical act of violence, combined with the impossibility of getting people to testify, made conviction genuinely difficult. This understanding shaped how he moved. He was visible enough to be known and feared within the gang world. He was sufficiently careful to avoid the kind of direct exposure that produced the evidence needed for a trial. For years, this balance held. West Midlands Police were aware of him. Intelligence about his activities accumulated in files. But connecting that intelligence to admissible evidence in a form that would survive a Crown Court trial was a different matter. He continued operating through the latter half of the 2000s and into the 2010s with the knowledge, validated twice in court, that the system had tried to hold him and had not managed it. The event that finally broke that balance began inside the Big Bang Snooker Club in the early hours of October the 30th, 2015. The violence that night arose not from the long-running feud with the Johnson crew, but from a falling out within the Burger Bar Boys themselves. Factions of the gang had come together at the venue, and the tensions between them had been building before the evening began. At some point in the early hours, those tensions broke into physical violence inside the club. Marvin Duffus, who was close to Beckford, was attacked. The attack on Duffus was extreme. He was stabbed and shot 5 times at close range in a sustained assault that left him with permanent brain damage. He survived, but he would never fully recover from what was done to him. Beckford saw what happened to Marvin Duffus. He responded in the way the logic of the gang world consistently produced, not with withdrawal, not with an attempt to de-escalate, but with the immediate application of counter-violence. He identified the man he believed responsible for the attack on Duffus, or believed responsible for directing it, and he moved after him outside the club. Here is where the detail that defines the killing becomes important. Beckford did not shoot the man he identified. He shot the man standing closest to him. Derek Jr. Myers was not the primary target. He was the target's closest associate, the man at his right hand. Beckford shot Myers in the jaw and in the chest. He was acting, in the terminology that the court would later use, to even the score. Myers died from his wounds. The man Beckford actually wanted was not the one who took the bullets. Outside the club on Soho Hill, in the immediate aftermath, there were witnesses. Inside the club, there had been 150 people. Police knew this. What they confronted in the days and weeks following the shooting was the same pattern they had encountered consistently in investigations connected to the Burger Bar Boys, a wall of silence. People who had been present when a man was shot dead on the street were not willing to identify who had done it. This was not indifference. It was the product of a rational calculation made by people who understood what the consequences of talking could be. The Burger Bar Boys had a history that made the cost of testimony against them very clear. Witnesses across the preceding 2 decades had faced pressure, threats, and violence. The community around Soho Hill in Hockley understood these facts without needing to be told them explicitly. Despite the silence, West Midlands Police built a case. CCTV footage was central. The area around the Big Bang Snooker Club was covered by cameras, and the movement of people in and out of the venue, on the street outside, and in the moments immediately before and after the shooting, could be reconstructed with considerable precision from the recorded footage. The footage was examined frame by frame. It showed the transfer of a weapon between people in the minutes before the killing. It showed Beckford's movements. It placed him in the specific location at the specific time. The trajectory of events could be reconstructed from the footage in a way that did not depend on any witness deciding to come forward. The physical evidence did what human testimony had consistently failed to do in cases involving this gang. When the case came to trial, Beckford faced a procedural challenge that arose from his own history. The nature of the charge and the strength of the available evidence made the trial unavoidable. What could be managed, or what his legal team attempted to manage, was the jury's knowledge of who he was. Beckford stood trial under a false identity. The purpose was straightforward: to prevent the jury from learning about the 2 previous serious cases, the 2000 murder charge and the 2003 connection to the Birchfield Road shootings, either of which might have shaped their perception of him before the evidence in the current trial had been laid out. The judge imposed restrictions on what could be disclosed about his background. The jury heard the evidence for the killing of Derek Myers without the full picture of the man they were judging. It was not enough. The CCTV evidence was specific. The reconstruction of events was detailed and internally consistent. The jury deliberated and returned a unanimous guilty verdict. Beckford was convicted of the murder of Derek Jr. Myers. He was also convicted of a separate firearms offence arising from the same incident. He was taken to Birmingham Crown Court for sentencing in December 2018. The judge imposed a mandatory life sentence and set the minimum term at 32 years. Beckford would have to serve those 32 years before he could apply to the parole board for release. Given his age at the time of sentencing and the minimum term imposed, the arithmetic was significant. Even at the earliest possible release date, he would be approaching 70 years old. For practical purposes, the sentence was likely to mean the rest of his active life behind bars. Detective Chief Superintendent Payne spoke publicly after the sentencing, in terms that reflected the weight both he and the force attached to the conviction. He described Beckford as an iconic criminal, a phrase with a specific meaning in the context of serious gang investigation, someone whose reputation and reach had become significant enough to shape the behavior of others around them, to function as a structural element of the organization, rather than just an operational one. Payne said Beckford had seen himself as above the law, as someone who could act with impunity, because the system had tried twice to hold him and twice failed. He said the sentence represented justice, and he said Birmingham was a safer city because of it. Coming from the head of the force's Serious Crime Directorate, these were not routine statements made for the sake of a press release. They reflected a genuine assessment of what Beckford's arrest and conviction had removed from the operational landscape of the city's organized crime world. The two previous acquittals deserve attention not simply as biographical detail, but as a lens through which to understand how the Birmingham gang world sustained itself through this period. Each time a senior figure faced a murder charge and was cleared, several things happened simultaneously. The individual returned to the organization stronger in reputation than before. The message to potential witnesses about the consequences of testimony was reinforced. The internal hierarchy of the gang absorbed the precedent that the justice system could be survived, and the intelligence files at West Midlands Police became more detailed, as each investigation gathered evidence that might not have been sufficient for that specific charge, but contributed to a longer picture of who was doing what and how. The Beckford case was eventually won precisely because the force had spent years understanding his patterns and building the kind of technical evidence base that did not require community testimony to succeed. The internal feud within the Burger Bar Boys that produced the Soho Hill shooting in 2015 was itself part of a broader pattern of fragmentation within both gangs during this period. By the mid-2010s, the clean territorial lines that had divided the Burgers from the Johnsons in the 1990s had become more complicated. Splinter groups, new alliances, disputes over money and supply that produced violence within the organizations, as well as between them. The shooting of Marvin Duffus, which had triggered Beckford's response that night, was not an attack from the Johnson crew, it was an attack from within. The feud had in some respects consumed itself, generating internal violence that mirrored the external kind. What Beckford's conviction did not do was end the Burger Bar Boys. The organization was older than any single member, and its operational continuity did not depend on the presence of any one person, however significant. The territory still existed. The supply chains still existed. The rivalries still existed. New figures moved into the spaces left by those imprisoned or killed. West Midlands Police had secured a landmark conviction. They had removed from the street someone whose 30-year presence had shaped the gang's violence and its capacity to evade accountability. That was not nothing. It was, in police terms, one of the most significant single results in 2 decades of work against the Burger Bar Boys. But the gang continued. The following year, 2016, produced a wave of shootings across the Handsworth and Winson Green areas that brought the Burger Bar and Johnson crew feud back into the news, with the same intensity it had generated in 2003. 7 people were injured in a series of incidents connected to that renewed violence. The man convicted in connection with those shootings was 20 years old at the time. He was from Winson Green. He had no memory of 2003, or of 1995, or of any of the years in which the foundations of the feud had been laid. He had simply grown up inside it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Next up, we turn to Notorious Stevenson, the man police called the untouchable godfather of Birmingham's gun supply network, whose operation provided the weapons that fueled the city's gang war, and the undercover sting that finally brought him down. Section 4. Notorious Stevenson. In a garden in Aston, West Midlands police officers dug up a Mac-10 machine pistol and a pump-action shotgun. The weapons had been buried there. They were part of a supply network that had been running for the better part of a year, moving firearms across Birmingham and beyond, coordinated by a man whose phone records connected him to every single deal, but who had never been found holding a weapon in his life. Notorious Stevenson was 41 years old when he was sentenced at Birmingham Crown Court in November 2015. He lived on St Michael's Road in Handsworth. He was known within the gang world as Nosa, a name that carried significant weight across both the Burger Bar Boys network and the wider criminal landscape of North and West Birmingham. The judge who sentenced him, His Honour Judge Burbidge, described him in court as the go-to man for obtaining firearms, and as the directing mind of an organised crime group built around the illegal supply of guns and ammunition. West Midlands Police described him as the untouchable godfather of the Burger Bar Boys. Both descriptions were intended to convey the same essential fact, that Stevenson occupied a position of structural importance within Birmingham's criminal economy that went beyond the acts of any individual transaction. He was not simply a dealer, he was the source. The operation that West Midlands Police built against Stevenson was called Operation Cookie. It was designed and run by the force's Serious and Organised Crime Unit, working with support from the National Ballistics Intelligence Service, the specialist body that tracks the movement of illegal firearms and ammunition across the United Kingdom. The sting was set up in the summer of 2014. It ran for the better part of 7 months, through surveillance operations and technical intelligence gathering, until January 2015. Over the course of that period, detectives intercepted the movement of weapons from suppliers to buyers on 5 separate occasions. 8 firearms were eventually seized. The Mac-10 machine pistol and the pump-action shotgun were among those recovered from the Aston Garden. Other weapons were found at premises in Great Barr and in Handsworth. One firearm was taken from a car in Hockley as it was in the process of being handed over to a buyer, a moment caught on surveillance at the exact point of exchange. What Stevenson was selling was not straightforward. The firearms at the centre of his operation were antique weapons, old enough in many cases to exist in a regulatory category that differed from modern firearms in ways that made them easier to acquire through certain channels. But antique weapons present an obvious practical problem for anyone trying to use them criminally. The ammunition they require may no longer be commercially manufactured in standard form. Stevenson's solution to this was to have ammunition custom-made. Thousands of rounds were produced specifically for the antique pistols and revolvers in his network, engineered to function reliably in weapons that would otherwise be largely ornamental. Each complete package, a working antique firearm with compatible custom ammunition, sold for approximately £3,000. This was not improvisation. It was a thought-through commercial operation with a specific product, a specific price point, and a specific customer base. The customer base was the criminal gangs of Birmingham and the surrounding region. Stevenson's operation supplied weapons to organisations active across the West Midlands, and the connection between his supply network and the violence those weapons subsequently produced was direct and traceable. West Midlands Police noted during the proceedings that the firearms Stevenson and his gang provided were similar in type and capability to the murder weapon used in the Aston shootings of January 2003, the MAC-10 that killed Charlene Ellis and Letitia Shakespeare on Birchfield Road. This was not a coincidental parallel. The Mac-10 had been a weapon of choice within the Burger Bar Boys network for years, valued for the rate at which it could discharge rounds. A Mac-10 machine pistol capable of firing 30 rounds in less than 2 seconds was not a defensive weapon. It was an offensive one, designed for close-range application of extreme force. That Stevenson's network was supplying weapons of this type into a market that had already demonstrated a willingness to use them on crowded public streets was understood by the court when it assessed the severity of what he had done. The economics of the gun supply operation illuminate something about how the upper levels of organised crime in Birmingham actually functioned during this period. Stevenson was not running the drugs. He was running the infrastructure that protected the drugs. In any criminal economy built around territorial drug dealing, weapons serve a specific purpose. They enforce the boundaries, collect debts that cannot be pursued through law, and deter competitors from taking what you have built. The higher the value of the territory, the more important the weapons become. A gang that can reliably access working firearms with compatible ammunition is in a fundamentally different position from one that cannot. Stevenson was providing the thing that made the territorial control sustainable. He was not at the sharp end of any specific act of violence, which was precisely why he had remained outside a prison cell for so long. The way his operation managed the risk of discovery followed a logic that was by this period well established within Birmingham's organised crime groups. Stevenson never touched the guns. The movement of weapons from suppliers to buyers was handled by others, each of whom occupied a position in the chain that could be prosecuted if they were caught, but that did not automatically expose the person further up. The organizers' protection came from distance. Instructions were communicated through phone calls and messages, rather than through direct contact. The money moved through intermediaries. The product moved through couriers. None of this was new. It was the same architecture that made prosecuting the leaders of the Burger Bar Boys and the Johnson crew consistently difficult across 2 decades of trying. What was different in Stevenson's case was the specific technical tool that West Midlands Police used to defeat it. Phone records were the instrument of his undoing. Although Stevenson was never observed in possession of a firearm, and although he was not present at any of the 5 interceptions that Operation Cookie carried out, his phone records connected him to each transaction and to every other individual in the conspiracy. Calls made before each deal, calls made after each deal. The pattern of communication between Stevenson and his right-hand man Sundish Nasran, and between Nasran and the runners below him, created a map of the organization that was visible in its entirety once the records were analyzed. Phone evidence of this kind cannot be intimidated into silence. It cannot decline to give a statement. It does not fear retaliation. It simply shows what it shows. And what it showed in this case was that Stevenson sat at the center of a network connecting every person and every transaction in the conspiracy. Sundish Nasran was 32 years old and lived on Nejon Close in Handsworth. He was the person closest to Stevenson in the operation, the individual who translated the directing mind's instructions into operational activity. He admitted his role and was jailed for 13 years at the November 2015 sentencing. Others in the network received sentences reflecting their specific positions. Rowan Gould, 33, of Reginald Road in Alum Rock, was jailed for 12 years and 3 months. Theodore Jr. Wigan, 28, of West Bromwich, received 10 years. Ifran Hussain, 25, of Handsworth Wood, received 10 years and 10 months. Mohammed Selumaya, 24, received 13 years. In total, 18 men were prosecuted across the conspiracy. 14 admitted the charges. 3 were found guilty after trial. The sentencing took place across 2 days in November 2015 and a final hearing in January 2016. The aggregate of the sentences imposed in November 2015 alone represented a substantial removal of operational capacity from Birmingham's illegal firearms market. Stevenson himself was sentenced to 16 years and 6 months. He had pleaded guilty. The plea came after the weight of the phone evidence made a trial of limited realistic prospects. A guilty plea at the appropriate stage carries a sentencing discount, and Stevenson's 16.5-year sentence reflected that reduction. The judge imposed it, and the case appeared to be concluded. It was not concluded. The Solicitor General at the time, Robert Buckland, reviewed the sentences handed down to 14 of the men convicted in the conspiracy and referred them to the Court of Appeal as unduly lenient. This is a specific mechanism in English law that allows the Crown to challenge a sentence it regards as falling below the appropriate level, and it is not used routinely. Its use in this case reflected a view at government level that the original sentences, across a network that had supplied firearms of the type used in some of Birmingham's most serious criminal violence, had not adequately captured the severity of what the men had done. The Court of Appeal agreed. The appeal hearing produced significant increases across the board. Stevenson's sentence was raised from 16 years and 6 months to 22 years. Nasran's was increased from 13 years to 17 years and 3 months. The combined additional time imposed across the 16 men whose sentences were reviewed came to more than 50 years. A government statement issued at the time of the appeal result described the outcome in terms of what it meant for public safety, noting that Stevenson's gang had presented a very real and dangerous threat to the people of Birmingham and the West Midlands. The language was formal, but the underlying point was straightforward. The original sentences had been too low for what the operation had actually done to the city. The phrase most often attached to Stevenson in the reporting of his case was untouchable. Chief Inspector Simon Wallace of West Midlands Police used it directly in his public statement following the sentencing, saying that Stevenson had been widely regarded as the untouchable godfather of the Burger Bar gang. This was not casual hyperbole. It described a specific and documented history. Stevenson had operated within or adjacent to the Burger Bar boys for years before Operation Cookie, and during those years he had remained outside the reach of any successful prosecution. His name appeared in intelligence. His role was understood at the operational level. What was lacking was the evidence capable of withstanding a Crown Court trial. Operation Cookie produced that evidence by building a technical case around phone records rather than around human testimony, exploiting the one weakness that Stevenson's model of distance and deniability had not fully protected against. The Nabby's involvement in the investigation deserves specific attention because it illustrates how the response to Birmingham's gun problem had evolved by the mid-2010s. The National Ballistics Intelligence Service was created precisely because the movement of illegal firearms in Britain had become a cross-force problem that required specialist coordination. A gun used in a shooting in Birmingham might have originated in another city or been moved through a supply chain involving multiple cities before it arrived. Nabis tracked weapons through ballistic forensics, connecting ammunition fired at one crime scene to ammunition from another, building a picture of where weapons had been and who had touched them. Its involvement in Operation Cookie gave the investigation a layer of forensic intelligence that standard surveillance alone would not have produced, and it contributed to the understanding of exactly how significant Stevenson's operation had been in terms of supply volume. Beyond the individual sentences, what Operation Cookie established was a factual picture of how the gun supply market serving Birmingham's gang war actually worked. It was not chaotic, it was structured. It had a principal at the top who directed without touching the product. It had a logistics layer, represented by Nasran and the others, who managed the physical movement of weapons. It had a customer base of criminal organizations who needed firearms to sustain their own operations. The £3,000 price point for a working weapon with custom ammunition was a commercial rate set by the economics of scarcity and risk. The antique weapon approach was a regulatory arbitrage, a deliberate choice to operate in a grey zone where the legal framework was less clearly defined than it was for modern commercially manufactured firearms. Every element of the operation reflected deliberate design. What Stevenson's network had been supplying were not fashion accessories or status items. They were instruments of lethal force that went from his supply chain directly into the hands of people prepared to use them on the streets of Handsworth, Hockley, Aston, and the surrounding areas. The Mac-10 buried in the Aston garden was the same model of weapon that had been used to kill 2 teenagers at a New Year's party 12 years earlier. Stevenson, sitting on St. Michael's Road in Handsworth and making phone calls that he believed were invisible, was a structural part of the machinery that made that kind of violence possible in Birmingham, year after year, decade after decade. The 22-year sentence that the Court of Appeal eventually set was a judicial acknowledgement of what that structural position actually meant. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Next up, we move to the heroin importation network that ran out of East Birmingham and sent 165 kilograms of heroin concealed inside industrial machinery from Lahore, and the 8 men who built a £17 million property empire from the proceeds. Section 5. The Zeb Khan Network. In July 2014, Border Force officers at the London Gateway Port opened a shipping container that had been declared as a consignment of industrial machinery. They cut into the body of one of the metal lathes inside. Packed within the machine, in the space where the engineering components should have been, was 165 kilograms of powdered heroin. What the officers had found was the second of 2 shipments, organized by a Birmingham-based criminal group that had been building a heroin importation operation out of East Birmingham for years. The first container, dispatched from Lahore via Karachi in February 2014, had passed through undetected. The second, which arrived in July, did not. The decision made by the National Crime Agency and Border Force at that moment, on the dock at London Gateway, would shape how the investigation proceeded. They did not seize the container. They removed the drugs, reassembled the lathes, and sent the shipment on to its delivery address. The destination was an industrial unit in Sandwell in the West Midlands. NCA surveillance officers were waiting when the container arrived. 2 men came to take delivery of it. Omar Issa, 36 years old, of Chipperfield Road in Castle Bromwich, and Imran Arif, 35, of Kenelm Road in Small Heath, signed for the consignment and began unloading the machinery. They had no idea the drugs were gone. They had no idea they were being filmed. They had no idea the conversations they were having at that loading dock were being recorded. The surveillance operation captured everything. The investigation that had begun at the port now had a physical thread extending into the heart of Birmingham, and officers followed it. The network that thread connected to had its roots in the Bordsley Green area of East Birmingham, a district of terraced housing and small commercial streets that sits several miles east of the city centre. Amiran Zeb Khan, 38 years old at the time of his eventual sentencing, lived on Cobham Road in Bordsley Green. He was one of 3 ringleaders at the top of the importation conspiracy. The other 2 were Muhammad Ali, 36, who also lived in Bordsley Green on Windcliffe Road, and Sajid Hussain, 32, of Fieldhouse Road in Yardley. These 3 men organised the shipments. They coordinated the supply chain from Pakistan. They managed the money and directed the people below them who handled the logistics and the physical movement of product. Amiran Zeb Khan was not unknown to law enforcement when Operation Cookie exposed the gun supply network around the same time. He was already a subject of NCA civil recovery and tax investigations that had been running for several years before the 2014 heroin importation. The NCA had established financial links between properties, cash, and individuals in the Zeb Khan network that pointed to the proceeds of drug trafficking and money laundering. A civil investigation that concluded in January 2017 saw 11 properties and bank account funds worth more than £2 million taken from Amaran and his associates after their owners were unable to demonstrate a legitimate source for the assets. Amaran Zeb Khan was a man the NCA knew well. The 2014 heroin importation was not a departure from established criminal activity. It was an escalation within a criminal career that had been running for some years before the lathes arrived at London Gateway Port. The route the heroin followed from Lahore to the West Midlands was specific and logistically deliberate. Lahore to Karachi by road or rail, then Karachi to London Gateway Port by sea freight inside a container described as holding industrial manufacturing equipment. This method of concealment reflects a calculated understanding of how customs inspection works at volume ports. The London Gateway Port handles hundreds of thousands of shipping containers a year. Physically opening every container is not feasible. Customs risk profiling targets a fraction of incoming freight, and the targeting is intelligence-driven. A container of industrial lathes from Pakistan, properly documented and commercially plausible, presented a lower immediate risk profile than many other consignment types. The group used this understanding deliberately. The February 2014 shipment passed through. They had every reason to expect the July shipment would do the same. The legitimate paperwork that made the shipments appear credible was not produced by accident. Rajesh Patel, 52, played a specific role in the conspiracy. He used his existing business to provide the documentation that made the containers appear to be genuine commercial imports. He gave the shipments a surface plausibility that they could not have achieved without access to a business with an established commercial profile. Patel was jailed for 15 years and 6 months at the July 2017 sentencing. Mohammed Ashaf Khan, 49, handled the logistical elements of the operation, managing the movement of shipments and the coordination between the Pakistan end and the Birmingham end of the supply chain. He received 17 years and 6 months. Zulfikar Munsaf, 38, was the member of the group who communicated the ringleader's instructions to those below them in the chain. He was the one person in the 8 who pleaded guilty before the trial reached its conclusion. He was sentenced to 14 years. Omar Issa and Imran Arif, who took delivery at the Sandwell Industrial Unit under the eyes of NCA cameras, completed the 8. Their role was the terminal end of the chain, the physical collection of product that had travelled from Lahore through Karachi to London Gateway and then to the Midlands. In a well-constructed importation conspiracy, the person who signs for the delivery is as distant as possible from the person who designed the route and supplied the funds. The protection that distance provides is meaningful up to the point where law enforcement collapses the distance through investigation, which is precisely what the NCA did here. The heroin recovered from the July 2014 container was analysed for purity. It tested at 58%, a high-grade importation, significantly above the average purity found at street level in British drug markets. Uncut, the 165 kilograms seized was worth approximately £5 million. What it was worth at street level depended on the cutting process, the adding of other substances to extend the volume, while reducing the purity to a more typical street percentage. At 25% purity, the amount recovered was calculated to be capable of producing up to 2 million individual street-level deals, generating revenue of up to £19,140,000. The NCA also had records indicating a first shipment of similar composition had passed through successfully in February 2014, which, if it contained a comparable quantity of heroin, would have approximately doubled the total value of the conspiracy. The group could potentially have earned £10 million from the 2 shipments combined. 7 of the 8 men were found guilty at Birmingham Crown Court on the 7th of July 2017. The 8th, Munsaf, had pleaded guilty before the trial began. The sentencing followed a week later, on the 14th of July. Amaran Zeb Khan, Muhammad Ali, and Sajid Hussain each received 22 years. Hussain was given an additional 9 months for a separate fraud offence. The combined sentences across all 8 defendants totaled 139 years and 4 months. Paul Risby, branch commander at the NCA, described the group in his post-sentencing statement as a determined and capable criminal organisation. The word capable is worth holding on to because it describes something specific about what this group was. They were not opportunists or amateurs. They had contacts in Pakistan capable of supplying high-purity heroin in the quantities needed to make container-scale importation economically rational. They had the capital to fund the operation. They had the access to legitimate business infrastructure, through Patel, to provide credible documentation. They had the logistical management, through Ashraf Khan, to coordinate a supply chain across 2 continents. Building this kind of operation requires genuine criminal sophistication, not just the willingness to take risks. The property portfolio that the NCA spent 8.5 years dismantling illustrates the scale of what the Zeb Khan network had accumulated across years of criminal income. 59 properties, located mainly in the West Midlands, were linked to the group through 4 connected civil recovery investigations that began in 2011. The majority were private residential properties in the Bawdsley Green and Selly Oak areas of Birmingham, rented out to generate a steady income that could circulate back through the legitimate economy. 34 of the properties were in Selly Oak, a district popular with students from the University of Birmingham, generating rental income from a population with no knowledge of who ultimately owned the homes they were living in. 3 properties were located in Bangor, in Northern Ireland, extending the portfolio's geographic reach beyond the West Midlands. Among the specific properties identified were a house worth £235,000 on Stony Lane in Birmingham that was in the process of being renovated as the Zeb Khan family home when the NCA's investigations reached it. A commercial building on Cherrywood Road had been converted into a gym called Rampage Fitness, a commercial enterprise that provided both a revenue stream and a degree of apparent legitimacy. None of the 59 properties had been purchased in the names of the principal criminals. The Zeb Khan family used a network of associates and relatives to hold the properties on their behalf, an arrangement that placed legal title in the names of individuals not directly connected to the criminal activity, but whose assets the High Court ultimately accepted were derived from it. When owners of the properties were invited to demonstrate the legitimate source of the funds used to acquire them, they could not do so. The final recovery order covering the bulk of the 59 properties was granted in 2020. Making the total value of assets recovered across the 4 connected investigations approximately £17 million. The properties were sold and the proceeds distributed between the NCA and the Treasury. Andy Lewis of the NCA noted at the time that without the property seizures, the principal figures would have emerged from prison into a £17 million asset base, ready to fund the next venture. Amerin Zeb Khan was serving his 22-year sentence when the NCA opened a new investigation into his activities, this time from inside prison. Sharing a cell with his nephew and lieutenant, Sarweeth Rehman, aged 29, Khan had developed a plan. He would offer the NCA what he presented as intelligence about an illegal firearms supply operation, in return for a reduction of approximately 10 years from his sentence. He and Rehman were in contact with 3 men on the outside: brothers Kaibar Rahman, aged 28, of Acox Green, and Akbar Rahman, aged 43, of Sparkhill, along with Ahmed Hussain, 29, of South Yardley. The plan was to arrange the purchase and transfer of firearms, and then pass the details of that transaction to NCA officers, as if providing genuine cooperative intelligence. The weapons being offered would in fact have been real, dangerous, and capable of causing serious harm in the community. The supposed intelligence would have been nothing more than the product of a staged operation Khan himself had manufactured, used to deceive the authorities into reducing a sentence he had legitimately earned. The NCA saw through the plan. Khan and his associates were charged and convicted. His sentence was extended rather than reduced, the opposite of the outcome he had engineered the scheme to achieve. The prison plot added a further dimension to the picture of Amerin Zeb Khan that had been building since the NCA first opened civil investigations into his network in 2011. This was a man who had spent years before his arrest running one of the most sophisticated heroin importation operations to originate from Birmingham, who had accumulated millions of pounds in property through nominees, who had fought the NCA's asset recovery investigations for years, and who had then, from a prison cell, attempted to use a staged firearms operation to manipulate the legal process from the inside. The sentence extension was the court's response to what it assessed as a man with no intention of altering his relationship with organised crime. The Zeb Khan network operated at a level of the criminal economy that the street-level gang violence of the Burger Bar Boys and the Johnson crew did not reach. It was an importation enterprise, not a territorial one. It did not need corners or postcodes. It needed supply chain contacts in Pakistan, logistics capability, financial infrastructure, and the ability to distribute bulk product to the middle market dealers who would then move it into the street economy. The network's product eventually reached Birmingham's streets, the same way all imported heroin does, through layers of distribution and cutting, through the county lines that pushed drugs outward into smaller towns, through the same drug trade that had fueled the Burger Bar Boys and Johnson Crew War for 2 decades. The violence at the street level and the importation at the top level were different expressions of the same underlying economy. Amir Zeb Khan never fired a gun at anyone, but the heroin he moved funded the world in which people did. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Next up, we turn to Alam Zeb Khan, the career criminal with 4 separate drug convictions spanning 3 decades, a £17 million property empire connected to his family network, and a 4th prison sentence collected at the age of 49. Section 6. Alam Zeb Khan. On the 4th of October 2023, NCA officers watched a 49-year-old man walk into a flat on a residential street in Small Heath, Birmingham, carrying a brown shopping bag. They had been watching him. When they moved in behind him, they found 2 heroin users inside the flat, just under 2 kilograms of heroin in the shopping bag, and a further 7 kilograms hidden around the property. The street value of what was in the flat that afternoon was approximately £1.5 million. Alam Zeb Khan was arrested. He was not surprised by the arrest. He was experienced enough in how investigations worked to understand that the sequence of events leading to it had been constructed over time, and that NCA officers do not move on a target without having built something they are confident in. What he may or may not have known in that moment was that this was the 4th time in 30 years that a criminal court would hear his name in connection with heroin. He had been to prison 3 times before. He had served a combined total of 19 years across those 3 sentences. He had been released each time, and each time had returned to the same activity in the same city with the same level of exposure to the consequences. The pattern his criminal career described was not one of impulse or opportunity. It was one of deliberate, sustained commitment to a specific criminal economy that he had never substantially moved away from. Alam Zeb Khan lived on Bawdsley Green Road in Birmingham. Bawdsley Green is a district of East Birmingham, within a short distance of the areas where both the Burger Bar Boys and the Johnson Crew had built their territorial operations across the 1990s and 2000s. It sits within the wider cluster of postcodes, B9 and the surrounding codes, that forms East Birmingham's most densely populated residential belt. The housing stock is Victorian terraced, close-packed, with small commercial streets running through it. It is an area where a man carrying a shopping bag into a residential block is not a remarkable sight. It is also an area that had for decades been part of the geography of Birmingham's heroin market. Khan's first conviction came approximately 30 years before his 2025 sentencing, placing it in the mid-1990s. The charge was possession of heroin with intent to supply, the foundational offence of street-level drug dealing. The sentence imposed at that point was not so severe as to register prominently in later accounts, but it established something that the following 3 decades would confirm repeatedly: that Alam Zeb Khan regarded heroin dealing as a viable and ongoing occupation, and that the discovery and punishment of it did not cause him to abandon it. The second conviction was more serious in scale and consequence. In 2000, Khan was convicted of heroin smuggling and sentenced to 12 years in prison. This was no longer street supply. Smuggling implies importation, the movement of product across borders in quantities designed for wholesale distribution rather than retail sale. The step up from supply to importation represents a significant change in a criminal's position within the drug economy. Importers sit above distributors. They deal in larger volumes, at higher wholesale prices, with greater capital requirements and greater potential rewards. Khan had evidently moved up the chain between his first and second convictions, acquiring the connections and the capital needed to operate at a level removed from street dealing. 12 years was the sentence that accompanied that move. 12 years in prison is not an abstract fact for a person in their late 20s or early 30s. It is a decade of their life removed and replaced with incarceration. For the period of that sentence, Khan was absent from the heroin market in Birmingham. His contacts aged and changed. The supply routes evolved. The organizations he had dealt with restructured. When he was released, the world he returned to was not identical to the one he had left. Most people who serve 12 years for drug smuggling and are then released do not immediately re-enter the same trade. The rational calculation is clear enough. The risk has proven real, the consequence has proven severe, the disruption to life has been total. Khan made a different calculation. He returned to offending. The third conviction came in 2012. The charge this time was connected to a cocaine supply plot. The court described him at sentencing as a significant player in a sophisticated and professional operation. The word sophisticated is precise here. It refers not to the act of selling drugs, but to the manner in which the operation was constructed and managed. A significant player in a sophisticated operation is not someone running errands or making deliveries on behalf of others. It is someone who has knowledge, authority, and organizational standing within a criminal enterprise. He was jailed for 7 years. Between his release from the 7-year sentence and his arrest in October 2023, Khan had spent a period outside prison during which the NCA was conducting parallel investigations into his finances. This is where the picture of Alamzeb Khan becomes most revealing, because the finances told a story that the criminal convictions alone could not fully capture. The money generated across his criminal career had to go somewhere. Drug income in the volumes that a figure of his standing would handle over 3 decades does not simply sit as cash under a mattress. It needs to move. It needs to acquire legitimacy. It needs to be turned into assets that look, on the surface, like the product of ordinary commercial activity. One of the mechanisms through which money moved within Khan's financial world was a restaurant in Ireland. The specifics of its operation and the period during which it functioned as a vehicle for moving criminal proceeds are documented in NCA records connected to the civil investigations that ran alongside the criminal prosecutions. In 2010, the lease of the restaurant was sold. The funds generated from that sale were transferred to Alamzeb Khan. He used the money to buy residential properties in Birmingham. The movement of cash from a restaurant lease sale in Ireland to property purchases in Birmingham is not in itself unusual. In the context of what NCA investigators had established about where that cash originated, it was a laundering step, the conversion of criminal proceeds into apparently legitimate property assets through the intermediate vehicle of a commercial transaction. The property route was not limited to Birmingham. Alamzeb Khan had acquired 4 homes in County Down in Northern Ireland, purchased using money that the NCA established had originated in drug trafficking and money laundering. County Down is a rural county south of Belfast, a long way from the Bordsley Green streets where Khan operated, and the geographic distance was likely part of the point. Properties held in Northern Ireland, away from the specific areas under NCA scrutiny in the West Midlands, presented a different investigative challenge than properties in Birmingham. They would not automatically come under scrutiny in a West Midlands-focused asset investigation. A team looking at Bordsley Green and Selly Oak properties might not immediately extend its search south of Belfast. The 4 County Down homes were eventually identified and seized after the NCA determined they had been bought with the proceeds of crime. The civil recovery investigations that targeted Khan's assets ran for approximately 8 years. The NCA conducted 4 connected investigations into dozens of individuals with financial links to the drug network that Khan was part of, a network that he shared with his brother Amerin and with a wider circle of associates and nominees who held assets on their behalf. Civil recovery is a specific legal mechanism that allows the courts to strip assets from individuals without a criminal conviction being required for the assets themselves. The standard of proof in civil proceedings is lower than in criminal ones. The NCA does not need to prove beyond reasonable doubt that specific assets were bought with the proceeds of a specific crime. It needs to demonstrate on the balance of probabilities that the assets are connected to unlawful conduct. In a case where a man has 3 prior drug convictions, no obvious legitimate income commensurate with his property portfolio, and financial records showing money moving through a restaurant and into real estate, the balance of probabilities points in a clear direction. The combined effect of the civil recovery proceedings and the criminal convictions was the surrender of assets worth £17 million, a figure that included Khan's share of the wider portfolio linked to the network. The properties were sold. The proceeds went to the NCA and the Treasury. Andy Lewis of the NCA observed at the time that, without those seizures, the principal figures would have emerged from their sentences into a £17 million asset base from which they could fund the next venture. The observation captures something important about how civil asset recovery changes the calculus of serious drug crime. A criminal sentence removes a person from the market temporarily. Removing their accumulated wealth changes what they return to. Khan was released from the 7-year sentence and entered a period in which, as far as the public record shows, he was not immediately rearrested, but the NCA's investigation into his finances continued. The civil proceedings moved through the courts. His assets were being identified, mapped, and challenged in parallel with his life on the outside. Whether this scrutiny changed his behavior or merely pushed it into forms that were harder to observe, the outcome in October 2023 was the same. Officers watching him that afternoon saw a man walking into a flat in Small Heath with a shopping bag. They had seen enough to move. What was inside the flat was the product of a supply chain. The 9 kilograms of heroin, packaged and hidden across a Small Heath flat, had not appeared there by accident. Someone had sourced it from a wholesale supplier. Someone had moved it to Birmingham. Someone had arranged for it to be stored and distributed. The 2 users already in the flat when officers arrived represented the terminal end of that chain, the street-level consumption point toward which the entire operation was oriented. Khan's presence in the flat, carrying 2 kilograms in a bag, placed him at one of the mid-chain positions, the person responsible for moving product toward the point of street sale. For a man who had once been described as a significant player in a sophisticated and professional operation, and who had once been convicted of large-scale heroin smuggling, this was a remarkably exposed position to be in. It suggests either a degree of financial pressure, a reduction in the level of the criminal operation he was still able to access, or simply the absence of caution that comes from having successfully avoided immediate consequences across a very long time. He pleaded guilty. The plea came in mid-2024. The sentencing hearing was held at Birmingham Crown Court on the 4th of April 2025. The judge imposed a sentence of 8 years and 1 month. Rick Mackenzie, the NCA's senior investigating officer, gave a statement after the sentence was handed down. His description of Khan as a career criminal who had dedicated his life to breaking the law was a precise one rather than a rhetorical flourish. A man with 4 drug convictions spanning 30 years, with prison terms totaling more than 19 years served, who at 49 years old was walking into a Small Heath flat with a shopping bag full of heroin, had made a clear and repeated series of choices about how to spend his life. The NCA statement that his heroin dealing had wrecked the lives of others was equally precise. Birmingham's heroin market, and the misery that attended it across the decades during which Khan operated, was fed from above by people like him. The users in the flat on the 4th of October were not abstract statistics. They were 2 people in a room in Small Heath whose access to heroin depended on a supply chain of which Alamzeb Khan was a willing and experienced part. What the full picture of Alamzeb Khan's criminal career illustrates about Birmingham's drug economy is specific. He was not a product of a single gang, not a territorial operator like the Burger Bar Boys or the Johnson crew, not an Encrochat-era operator of the kind that later sections of this video examine. He was something older and in some respects more durable. A man who had built a relationship with heroin dealing so deep and so financially rewarding that 30 years of criminal justice engagement, including 3 prison sentences and the confiscation of £17 million in assets, had not caused him to stop. The deterrent effect of prosecution and imprisonment, substantial as those consequences are in absolute terms, had not been sufficient for him. Each time he returned from prison, heroin was still there, the market was still there, and the skills and contacts he had built over decades were still available to him. This is the structural reality that sits beneath the individual cases of every figure in this video. The criminal economy that produced the Burger Bar Boys and the Johnson crew, the gun supply network that No Sakir Stevenson built, the heroin importation operation that Ameran Zeb Khan ran, and the 30-year career of Alamzeb Khan are all expressions of the same underlying fact. Birmingham's drug market was large enough, and resilient enough, and financially rewarding enough that it continued to attract and sustain operators at every level of sophistication and ambition. When one operation was dismantled, another continued. When one figure was imprisoned, another moved into the space. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Next up, we cover Arfan Mirza, the Birmingham man who ran 30 separate heroin shipments from Pakistan, disguised as shopping bags, imported 220 kilograms over 11 months, and told a court the whole thing was a victimless crime. Section 7. Arfan Mirza. In February 2020, Border Force officers at Heathrow Airport opened 2 consignment packages that had been listed on their documentation as containing shopping bags from Pakistan. Inside each package was heroin, 20 kilograms in total, across the 2 boxes. The investigation that followed would establish that these were not the first such packages, and not the last. Arfan Mirza was 42 years old and lived on Common Lane in the Sheldon area of Birmingham, a quiet residential district in the southeast of the city, a long way in atmosphere from the terraced streets of Handsworth, or the gang territory of Lozells and Aston. He was the father of 4 children. He was not a person whose visible life would have marked him as the head of an operation that, across 11 months, moved 220 kilograms of heroin from Pakistan into the United Kingdom. The NCA investigation that began when the 2 Heathrow packages were intercepted would establish exactly that. The investigation did not begin with Mirza's name. It began with the packages. Border Force officers had intercepted 2 consignments in February 2020. The consignments were listed as containing shopping bags, the kind of plastic carrier bags manufactured in quantity in Pakistan and exported across the world as a low-value commercial product. Boxes of carrier bags are not an unusual export. They are precisely the kind of unremarkable consignment that moves through international freight at volume without attracting sustained attention. That was the point. A consignment of shopping bags from Pakistan is a mundane item in the documentation of any air cargo operation. It is not the kind of declaration that triggers a priority inspection. Mirza had selected his cover precisely because of this quality, and the selection had worked for months before it stopped working. NCA investigators began with the 2 intercepted packages and worked outward from them. Phone data was their primary tool, the records of calls, messages, and movements associated with the numbers linked to the consignments. They also worked through the business records held by the courier companies that had received and processed the packages. What this combination of phone and courier data revealed was not 2 packages but 30. Mirza had been operating since March 2019. Over the 11 months between then and the February 2020 interception, he had been behind the importation of approximately 30 individual consignments, each following the same method, each declared in the same or similar terms, each moving heroin from Pakistan to Birmingham through air freight channels. The 2 packages that Border Force caught were the ones that ended the run. The 29 or so before them had arrived, been collected, and been distributed without interception. The investigators brought in others to accept deliveries at their addresses. This was not incidental to the operation. It was a deliberate structural feature designed to prevent any single address from accumulating enough documented deliveries to attract investigative attention. Spreading the reception of packages across multiple people and multiple addresses reduced the density of any signal that might flag to customs or courier risk teams. Each individual recipient receiving 1 or 2 packages was less visible than a single person receiving 30. The use of others also provided Mirza with a layer of deniability. He could present himself as removed from the physical receipt of the drugs, even if the phone records and financial flows pointed directly back to him at every stage. At Mirza's home on Common Lane, officers found components from the carrier bags that had been used as the cover load, the physical shopping bags around and among which the heroin had been concealed. They also found multiple mobile phones and SIM cards, the numbers from which could be matched against contact details that appeared on the consignment documentation. The presence of these items at his address placed him in direct contact with the operational infrastructure of the importation. He was not a name that appeared once in a phone record and could plausibly claim coincidental contact. He was the person at the center, with the cover load remnants and the communications equipment sitting in his house. What the officers also found on Mirza's phone was a form of evidence unusual even in complex drug importation cases. There were videos. In those videos, Mirza could be seen handling the heroin and testing its purity. Testing purity is a specific act that tells investigators something precise about a person's position in the supply chain. A courier who carries packages without knowing their contents does not test purity. A street dealer who sells to individual users does not typically have the equipment or expertise to test purity. Purity testing is done by importers and middle-market wholesalers who are making quality assessments before they move product further down the chain, who need to know what they received matches what was agreed and what the cutting requirements will be before they price and distribute it. The existence of those videos was not just evidence of guilt, it was a description of role. Mirza was the person at the point where the heroin arrived in the UK and was assessed before distribution, the person who verified the product and forwarded it to the networks below. One account of the phone footage described it as functioning as an advertisement for street dealers, a piece of communication designed to demonstrate product quality to the buyers further down the chain. Whether framed as a quality control record or as promotional material, The videos documented Mirza's active, informed, expert engagement with the heroin he was importing. These were not the images of a man who had allowed a parcel to be delivered to his house for £1,000 in debt relief. That story, the gambling debt story, was what Mirza offered when NCA officers arrested him in February 2020 and conducted interviews. He told them that an unknown person had agreed to reduce his gambling debts by £1,000 if he permitted a parcel to be delivered to his address. The account was designed to portray him as a passive and largely unwitting participant, a man who had made one bad decision under financial pressure, rather than the head of a sustained importation enterprise. The NCA rejected it entirely. The investigation had produced phone data, courier records, videos of him testing purity, cover load components, and multiple SIM cards linked to the operation. The gap between what the evidence showed and what the gambling debt story claimed was too wide to bridge. He had been running the UK end of the importation for 11 months. He had personally collected drugs and forwarded them to others. He had tested purity and filmed himself doing it. The £1,000 gambling debt explanation addressed none of this. NCA analysts calculated the scale of what the 30 or so consignments had brought into the country. 220 kilograms of heroin across the 11 months between March 2019 and February 2020. At street value, the total came to approximately £22 million. This figure represents what the heroin would generate at street level after it had been cut from its import purity down to the lower concentrations at which it is typically sold to individual users. At each stage of cutting and distribution, value is added and risk is redistributed downward. The importer, in this model, takes the greatest risk but also the greatest margin. He buys the product at the Pakistan end price, bears the risk of the import, and sells it at a multiple of what he paid. The distributors below him take the next level risk and margin. The street dealers at the bottom carry the most exposure to arrest and the least financial return. What 220 kilograms of heroin does as it moves through that distribution chain matters. It is not an abstract commercial quantity. At street level, it reaches hundreds of individual users across the city and potentially beyond it, depending on how far Mirza's distribution network extended. County lines operations, which were an established feature of Birmingham's drug market by 2019, push product from urban supply points outward into smaller towns and rural areas, using young people as runners and dealers in ways that constitute a form of exploitation the courts have consistently categorized as serious harm to those involved. The heroin that Mirza imported did not arrive at the point of use without passing through those networks. His £22 million in street value was generated partly through the exploitation of vulnerable young people who served as the operational workforce of those lines, often under coercion. Mirza's claim, made at various points during his 7-week trial at Birmingham Crown Court, that his operation was a victimless crime, addressed none of this. The framing rests on a libertarian premise that drug use is a personal choice, that supplying drugs merely meets a demand that exists independently of the supply, and that the supplier therefore bears no responsibility for the consequences of consumption. Courts have consistently found this analysis unpersuasive, and the NCA's operations manager, Rick Mackenzie, addressed it directly in his statement after the sentencing. The county lines connection was specifically named. Importations at this scale, he observed, fuel the criminal exploitation of young people through county lines as well as gang-related violence that impacts communities across the UK. The heroin that moved through Mirza's operation connected at its far end to the same street economy whose violence had defined Birmingham's gang landscape for decades. During the trial, as the evidence mounted around him, Mirza's position shifted. He admitted his involvement. He admitted that previous parcels had contained heroin. He admitted that he had collected the drugs and forwarded them to others in the supply chain. The admissions, coming in the course of a 7-week trial rather than as a guilty plea, represented a partial acknowledgement of what the evidence had already established. They came too late to attract the sentencing discount that a timely guilty plea would have carried, and they came without the remorse that might have influenced the judge's assessment of his culpability. Judge Heidi Kubik KC presided at the sentencing on the 17th of February 2023. She described Mirza as the head of the drugs operation in the UK and observed that he had played a pivotal role in the success of the illegal activity. She noted his lack of remorse. She said he had provided only a self-serving account of how he became involved, a characterization that encompassed both the gambling debt story and the victimless crime position. Each was an account shaped by self-interest, rather than by honest engagement with what he had done. The sentence she imposed was 20 years imprisonment. The Zeb Khan operation involved ringleaders, logistics managers, papering through legitimate businesses, industrial machinery as cover, and a supply chain sophisticated enough to have passed one successful shipment before the second was intercepted. Mirza was a different kind of operator. He ran the UK end of an operation structured around consignments of shopping bags, brought in others to receive packages at various addresses, and managed the distribution himself after taking delivery and testing the product. Both operations were significant in scale. Mirza's was architecturally simpler, but 220 kilograms of heroin in 11 months, at a street value of £22 million, is not a small enterprise by any measurement. He had found a method that worked, refined it with dummy deliveries before committing to it, and run it for the better part of a year before the 2 intercepted boxes at Heathrow ended it. The dummy delivery approach is worth examining specifically because it tells us something about how Mirza thought about risk management. Before sending heroin, he sent packages that would have contained nothing incriminating to establish the delivery route, to confirm that the courier chain would handle the consignments without incident, to test whether the specific addresses he was using would attract scrutiny. Only once the route was operationally tested did he begin moving the drug. This is not the behavior of someone driven by impulse or desperation. It is the behavior of someone who understood that his method had exploitable weaknesses and worked to reduce those weaknesses before loading them with value. The £1,000 gambling debt story, held against this operational picture, is not merely implausible, it describes a completely different person. His children were 4, his address was Sheldon. The distance between Common Lane and the streets of Handsworth or Lozells, where the drugs he imported eventually arrived, is not simply geographical. It is a distance in the criminal food chain between the person who moves product by the kilogram and the people on the street corners below. Mirza sat in his Sheldon house and managed a £22 million operation whose terminal point was heroin users in Birmingham's most deprived communities, running it for 11 months before a border force officer at Heathrow opened 2 boxes that were supposed to contain plastic bags. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Next up, we turn to Daniel Aziz and Michael Earp, 2 Birmingham men whose EncroChat handles, Lushmace and Kneetown, led NCA investigators through over 22,000 messages and into a drugs and firearms operation that earned them a combined 59 years in prison. Section 8. Daniel Aziz and Michael Earp. Between March and June 2020, French law enforcement officers, working alongside Dutch and British counterparts, placed malware on the servers of EncroChat, a privately operated encrypted communications platform used by tens of thousands of criminals across Europe. For 74 days, the messages passing between 60,000 users became readable to investigators who had previously been shut out entirely. Among those users were Lushmace and Kneetown. EncroChat had operated since approximately 2016 as what was, in effect, a private telecommunications network built for organized crime. The devices that ran it were modified smartphones, stripped of their cameras and GPS functionality, running custom encrypted software that made messages unreadable to anyone without the corresponding decryption key. They cost approximately £1,500 per handset, with subscription fees of around £800 for 6 months. The price and the infrastructure were not incidental, they were signals that filtered the customer base. At those costs, and with that level of operational security, the platform attracted the people at the upper levels of the criminal economy, the organizers and the principals, the individuals whose exposure to arrest would have the most significant operational consequences for the organizations they ran. By 2020, the NCA estimated there were approximately 10,000 EncroChat users in the United Kingdom. Law enforcement had described the sole purpose of the platform as coordinating the distribution of illicit commodities, laundering money, and plotting to kill rival criminals. The cracking of the platform was the product of a multi-year international investigation that had begun in France in 2017. The breakthrough came when investigators gained access to the EncroChat server infrastructure, which was based in France. The malware they deployed intercepted messages before they could be encrypted for transmission, and also captured lock screen pins, which allowed investigators to attribute devices to individuals even where users had tried to maintain operational anonymity. By April 2020, the NCA was receiving a live feed of messages sent by UK-based EncroChat users, reading in real time what the users believed no one else could see. The Dutch chief of national police later described the experience of access as being like sitting at the table where criminals were chatting, watching the conversation unfold as it happened. Subscribers to EncroChat had exchanged messages of considerable frankness precisely because they believed the platform's security was absolute. That belief was the source of their candor. It was also their undoing. Operation Venetic was the NCA-led UK response. By July 2020, following the EncroChat servers being shut down after their compromise became known to users, the initial results of the investigation included 746 arrests, £54 million in seized cash, 77 firearms, and over 2 tons of drugs. Across Europe, the operation eventually contributed to the arrest of more than 6,500 suspects, the seizure of 103 tons of cocaine, and the recovery of over 900 weapons. For serious and organized crime prosecution in the United Kingdom, it was the most significant intelligence gain since the introduction of intercept evidence as a tool. The messages were not merely evidence of intent. They were real-time operational records of decisions made, instructions given, quantities confirmed, and money moved. The investigators who worked through the EncroChat data linked to Birmingham identified 2 handles that became the center of a major investigation: Lushmace and Kneetown. The process of attribution, connecting a handle to a real person, involved cross-referencing message content with phone records, surveillance data, and the physical movements of individuals and packages already known to investigators. In excess of 22,000 messages were examined to build the case against Daniel Aziz and Michael Earp. The messages documented the operation in its own words. Aziz, 32 years old at sentencing and from Stekford in Birmingham, was the ringleader. Earp, also in his 30s and from Shard End, was the operational arm. What the messages showed, once investigators had worked through the volume and attributed the handles, was an organized crime group that had integrated drug supply and firearms acquisition into a single enterprise, each element supporting the other. The drugs generated the money funded the weapons enforced the commercial relationships that the drugs trade required: collection of debts, deterrence of competition, intimidation of customers who were slow or unwilling to pay. This integration of narcotics and firearms was not incidental. It was structural, the natural outcome of operating in a market where violence is the only enforcement mechanism available. Aziz directed Earp through EncroChat messages with the regularity and specificity of a logistics manager communicating with a delivery operative. Instructions about where to go, what to collect, what to drop off, whose money to take, and how to update on stock levels moved between Lushmace and Kneetown as a matter of daily operational routine. Earp's role was physical and mobile. He moved drugs money to locations Aziz specified, picked up and delivered product, and managed the collection and transport of weapons. In one message, Aziz indicated that a payment of £200,000 had been made 2 days prior, a figure that gives a sense of the scale at which the financial flows of the operation were running. In another, writing from behind his handle, Aziz discussed having a gun and bullets in his possession and described using it against customers who owed him money. The message was not rhetorical. It was a statement of operational practice. The firearms were there to enforce debt collection. The drugs quantities the NCA attributed to Aziz from the message evidence were substantial, even by the standards of the cases already covered in this video. From just 3 months of EncroChat messages, investigators attributed to Aziz the movement of more than 40 kilograms of heroin and more than 52 kilograms of cocaine. These were not estimates extrapolated from partial data. They were figures drawn from the message content itself, which documented specific consignments, specific handovers, and specific quantities agreed and confirmed. The NCA branch commander who spoke after the sentencing described Aziz as a major player who had orchestrated the movement of these volumes across Birmingham and beyond. The operation reached both locally and to other parts of the United Kingdom through the network of buyers Aziz supplied. The base from which the group operated was a rented flat in Sapphire Heights, a building in Hockley in the north of Birmingham city centre. Cash and drug paraphernalia recovered from the flat placed it as the operational hub. Earp was captured on CCTV footage in the Sapphire Heights car park in an exchange that became one of the most specific pieces of physical evidence in the case. He and an associate were filmed transferring handguns between themselves in the car park, weapons the investigators established the group had acquired and were attempting to sell. The CTV footage and the EncroChat messages together produced a picture of an operation that was simultaneously drug supply and firearms trading, with Aziz at the center of both. The firearms dimension of the case was not limited to the pistols exchanged in the Sapphire Heights car park. At Nicole Roan's home in Bawdsley, officers discovered a Scorpion submachine gun hidden under her bed. Roan, 29 at the time of her arrest, was Earp's cousin. The Scorpion, a Czech-designed compact automatic weapon, was loaded. It had a compatible magazine inserted and additional bullets available. The weapon capable of fully automatic fire was not being stored casually or accidentally. It was being stored by a person who was functionally part of the operation, whose home was being used to hold the most dangerous item in the group's arsenal. In a wardrobe in a child's bedroom at the same property, officers found further ammunition compatible with the Scorpion. The proximity of a loaded submachine gun and its ammunition to a child's sleeping space illustrated something about how completely the logic of the criminal operation had colonized the domestic life of those connected to it. 3 Walther Creed 9mm semi-automatic pistols formed another element of the weapons recovered in the case. Their route into the hands of Aziz's group was documented through EncroChat messages and subsequently through the investigation that followed. Rizwan Malik, 43 years old and of Small Heath in Birmingham, was directed through EncroChat communications to attend the Sapphire Heights address in Hockley in April 2020. He arrived in a van and met Earp in the car park, where the 3 pistols were transferred. CCTV footage captured the handover. Aziz, receiving the weapons through Earp, was accumulating a firearms inventory designed to support the enforcement functions of a drug supply operation operating at significant commercial scale. The broader network connected to Aziz and Earp through EncroChat extended beyond Birmingham. Alexi Morgan, 30 years old and from West Bromwich, used the handle Denzel Boss and was an associate who liaised with the group to supply drugs across the West Midlands region. From EncroChat evidence alone, Morgan was attributed with supplying 27 kilograms of Class A drugs with a wholesale value of more than £800,000. One specific transaction documented in the messages illustrated the recklessness with which the operation conducted its business. On the 4th of April 2020, Morgan organised the exchange of 5 kilograms of cocaine and £188,000 in cash outside a primary school in Walsall. A school was not an incidental location. It was simply the agreed meeting point, chosen apparently without any consideration of what it was. Morgan failed to appear at Birmingham Crown Court for the start of his trial. A jury delivered guilty verdicts against him in his absence in April 2025. He was sentenced to 15 years and 6 months. Aziz, Earp and Roan were arrested between May and July 2020, shortly after the EncroChat platform was shut down, and as investigators moved to convert the intelligence gathered during the 74 days of access into arrests and charges. The gap between arrest and conviction in this case was 3 years, a period reflecting the volume and complexity of the evidence that the prosecution needed to work through and present. In excess of 22,000 messages required analysis, attribution, and explanation to a jury. The trial itself ran for 6 weeks at Birmingham Crown Court before concluding with guilty verdicts on the 1st of June 2023. All 3 defendants were convicted: Aziz of conspiring to supply Class A drugs, of 2 counts of possessing a firearm with intent to endanger life, of 2 counts of possessing a prohibited firearm, of 2 counts of possessing prohibited ammunition, and of money laundering. Earp was convicted of drugs and firearms offences. Roan was convicted of possessing a firearm and prohibited ammunition. The sentencing hearing took place on the 13th of October 2023. Aziz received 33 years in prison. Earp received 26 years. Roan received 5 years. The combined sentence for Aziz and Earp alone, 59 years, reflected the court's assessment of an operation that had moved nearly 100 kilograms of Class A drugs in a 3-month documented window, acquired and traded multiple firearms, including a submachine gun, and used the threat of violence as an operational instrument against debtors and competitors. The Aziz and Earp case sits within Birmingham's criminal history in a specific way. The Burger Bar Boys and the Johnson crew built their operations across the 1990s and 2000s in territorial networks defined by postcodes and street corners, enforced through shootings and visible gang presence. The EncroChat generation operated differently. Aziz did not need corners. His operational model was based on communications infrastructure, on the ability to manage supply chains, money movements, and weapons acquisitions through a platform that, until its compromise, was effectively invisible to law enforcement. The drugs he moved came through the same Pakistan-linked supply routes, the same Birmingham wholesale channels, the same street-level distribution networks. But the layer above the street, the layer where Aziz and Earp operated, had been reorganized around encrypted communications in a way that made it harder to see and, until EncroChat was cracked, harder to prosecute. Operation Venetic removed that protective layer and made the messages visible. What it found, reading the words of Lushmace and Kneetown as they moved 40 kilograms of heroin and 52 kilograms of cocaine in 3 months, was that the underlying economy had not changed. Only the communications had. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Next up, we cover Thomas Kavanagh, the Kinahan cartel's senior figure in the UK, who ran a £30 million drug empire from a fortified mansion near Birmingham, and whose sentence was extended after he tried to con the NCA with a buried gun cache in a field in Northern Ireland. Section 9. Thomas Kavanagh. On the 12th of January 2019, Thomas Kavanagh walked off an international flight at Birmingham Airport. He had been on holiday in Mexico. 2 of his sons were travelling with him. NCA officers were waiting at arrivals. They arrested him on the spot. His sons were released. Kavanagh was not. Kavanagh was 51 years old at the time of his arrest, an Irish national who had left Dublin approximately a decade earlier after the Criminal Assets Bureau in Ireland issued him with a substantial tax demand he had no legitimate income to explain. He had 16 previous convictions in Ireland, spanning assault, threats to kill, possession of firearms, and assaults on members of the Garda Síochána, the Irish police. He was not a peripheral figure in Irish criminal life. He was a known and documented one, which was precisely why the Criminal Assets Bureau had reached him, and precisely why he had chosen to move. He relocated to Birmingham, where he bought a house and opened a motor dealership, a business that provided a surface of legitimate commercial activity and a mechanism through which money could circulate with a degree of explanation attached. From Birmingham, he eventually moved to Tamworth, a market town in Staffordshire, 14 miles north of the city centre, where he bought a property on Sutton Road, in the area's most exclusive residential district, a street shared with celebrities and professional footballers. The house on Sutton Road was not a standard property. It was a gated mansion equipped with reinforced doors and bulletproof glass, modifications that served a specific function for a man in Kavanagh's position. The reinforcement was not paranoia. It was the physical expression of a professional reality. The person who runs the UK end of a major organised crime group is someone whose rivals have both the motivation and the capability to mount an attack on his home. The Kinahan organised crime group, of which Kavanagh was the senior UK figure, operated in an environment of extreme violence, primarily in Ireland, where an ongoing feud with a rival Dublin criminal organisation had produced a series of murders across the preceding years. David Byrne, a Kinahan associate, had been shot dead at the Regency Hotel in Dublin in February 2016 in an attack that escalated an already bloody conflict. The bulletproof glass at the Tamworth mansion was not decorative, it was insurance. The Kinahan organised crime group was one of the most significant Irish criminal networks operating internationally by the mid-2010s. It was involved in drug supply at a significant scale, in firearms trafficking, in money laundering, and in the management of violence that attended each of those activities. The NCA described it as an organisation synonymous with acts of violence. Its reach extended beyond Ireland and the United Kingdom into Spain, the United Arab Emirates, and other jurisdictions where its members had established themselves to access supply routes, manage finances, and maintain a physical distance from the most visible aspects of their criminal activity. Kavanagh's role within this network was specific and senior. The NCA assessed him as the figurehead of the Kinahan organisation in the UK, the person through whom the group's UK operations were managed and coordinated. The Deputy Director of Investigations at the NCA described him publicly as effectively the group's top man in Britain. The chain of events that eventually produced Kavanagh's arrest began in October 2017, 2 years before Birmingham Airport. On the 2nd of that month, NCA officers intercepted a consignment at Dover. Inside, 2 6-ton industrial tarmac removal machines were 15 kilograms of cocaine and approximately 200 kilograms of cannabis. The machines had been specifically adapted to create concealed spaces capable of holding the drugs. The technique was the same one the Zeb Khan network had used with industrial lathes in 2014. Industrial machinery as a cover for drug concealment, moving through freight channels that presented as legitimate commercial import. The Dover consignment was the one that was caught. Communications evidence later established that at least 4 prior importations had passed through successfully before law enforcement identified the route and intercepted this shipment. The estimated street value of the cocaine importations the group made across the full period the conspiracy was assessed to have operated came to approximately £23,400,000. Cannabis importations over the same period added a further estimated £6,400,000. The NCA's total estimate for the group's UK drug supply operations sat at around £30 million. Following the Dover interception, NCA investigators used the evidence gathered at the port to trace the operation back into the Midlands. 2 industrial units connected to the conspiracy were identified and raided, one in Wolverhampton and one in Wednesbury. At the Wednesbury unit, officers found a black holdall containing a handgun and ammunition. DNA recovered from the weapon belonged to Martin Byrne, a 4th member of the conspiracy, who died before the case reached court. The industrial units provided a picture of how the UK end of the operation was managed. Machinery came in through legitimate freight, was received at industrial addresses that offered privacy and space, and was processed before distribution. The cash that represented the proceeds moved in the other direction, back through similar channels toward the source. Gary Vickery and Daniel Canning were Kavanagh's principal associates in the UK operation. Both were Dublin-born. Vickery, who lived in Solihull in the West Midlands, was described in court as sitting immediately beneath Kavanagh in the hierarchy. Canning, also of Solihull, was Vickery's brother-in-law and subordinate. The chain, from Kavanagh down through Vickery to Canning, was a clear layered structure, each level with its own exposure and its own designated responsibilities, each layer providing a degree of separation from the one above it. In addition to the drug conspiracy, Canning admitted possessing a firearm and ammunition, an element of the case that reinforced the NCA's broader picture of the group as one that integrated firearms into its operational practice. Vickery had been in Lanzarote when the investigation concluded in arrests, and had to be extradited to face proceedings in the UK. All 3 men pleaded guilty in July 2020. The sentencing was substantially delayed. Legal arguments absorbed time, the coronavirus pandemic affected court scheduling, and Vickery's extradition from Lanzarote added its own delay. The sentencing hearing eventually took place at Ipswich Crown Court on the 28th of March 2022. The choice of Ipswich rather than a Midlands court followed the same logic that had placed the 2003 Aston murder trial in Leicester. Distance from the operational geography of the defendants reduced the risk of jury intimidation in a case involving an organised crime group of national and international significance. Judge Martin Levitt imposed 21 years on Kavanagh, 20 years on Vickery, and 19 years and 6 months on Canning. The judge characterised the operation as running on a commercial scale and stated that he had no doubt the successful importations would have continued indefinitely were it not for the Dover interception in October 2017. The NCA searched the Tamworth mansion after Kavanagh's airport arrest. What officers found inside documented the domestic reality of running a senior position in a violent criminal network. Knives, baseball bats and swords were distributed through the property alongside the architectural modifications. A combination torch and stun gun, illegal to possess in the United Kingdom, was among the weapons recovered. For this specific item, Kavanagh was eventually given a separate 3-year jail sentence, served alongside the principal term. Cash of approximately £35,000 in various denominations was seized, as were high-value items including watches, jewellery, and luxury clothing that the NCA immediately placed under freezing orders. The physical inventory of the property, taken alongside the financial picture that the NCA's ongoing investigation was assembling, gave a detailed account of what the proceeds of running the Kinahan Group's UK operations looked like in material terms. That picture extended beyond the mansion. A villa in Spain formed part of the asset base, along with other properties in the United Kingdom. The NCA's financial investigation, running in parallel with the criminal prosecution, set about tracing and quantifying what could be recovered. The assessment of Kavanagh's total criminal profits arrived at approximately £12,200,000. What the investigators were eventually able to identify as recoverable assets was substantially less, £1,123,096. The confiscation order reflecting that figure was made at Ipswich Crown Court on the 25th of July 2025. Kavanagh was told to pay the sum within 3 months, or face a further 12 years in prison on top of the 21 he was already serving. Vickery was ordered to pay £109,312, with a 2-year default term. The gap between the estimated criminal profits and the recoverable assets tells its own story about how the finances of organised crime at this level operate. £12 million generated across years of drug importation does not sit as recoverable cash. It moves through property purchases in multiple jurisdictions, through business investments, through the hands of nominees and associates who hold assets on behalf of the principals, through currencies and jurisdictions that present their own investigative challenges. By the time a confiscation order comes to be made, much of what was generated has already been placed beyond the reach of civil recovery. The 1 million recovered against 12 million estimated is not a failure of investigation. It is an illustration of how deliberately the dispersal of criminal proceeds is managed by people who have spent years learning what law enforcement can reach. The gun cash plot, which added a further 6 years to Kavanagh's sentence, is one of the most brazen attempts to manipulate the criminal justice system documented in any Birmingham-connected case. While serving his 21-year term, Kavanagh enlisted his brother-in-law Liam Byrne, 44, of Dublin, and an associate, Sean Kent, 38, of Liverpool. The three, communicating through channels they believed were secure, arranged for a collection of firearms to be acquired and buried in a field outside Newry, in Northern Ireland. The plan was to then lead NCA officers to the buried cache, presenting the information as genuine intelligence cooperation under the provisions of law that allow sentence reductions in exchange for substantive assistance to law enforcement. Kavanagh calculated that this apparent cooperation could reduce his sentence by approximately 10 years. The plan failed because the communications were not secure. Incriminating messages connecting the conspirators to the scheme were identified by investigators using EncroChat data, the same platform whose cracking had already produced the Aziz and Earp case. The cache was real. The weapons buried in Newry were genuine firearms that would have been dangerous on the street, but the intelligence about them was manufactured, and the entire operation was designed to deceive rather than to assist. Sentencing took place at the Old Bailey, with Kavanagh appearing via video link from his prison. He received 6 additional years, to run consecutively with his existing 21. Liam Byrne received 5 years. Sean Kent was also imprisoned. Jack Kavanagh, Thomas's son, and 24 years old at the time of his involvement becoming public, was arrested in Spain at Malaga Airport. He was extradited to the UK and pleaded guilty to 2 charges of conspiracy to possess a firearm and 2 offences of plotting to possess ammunition connected to the gun cache scheme. He had already been on remand in relation to separate and serious drug supply charges. Thomas Kavanagh's attempt to use the buried weapons to reduce his own sentence had been designed in part to benefit his son as well, a calculation that, like the scheme itself, did not produce the intended outcome. What the Kavanagh case places into the Birmingham criminal landscape is the international dimension. The Burger Bar Boys and the Johnson crew were territorial, their violence and their commerce anchored in postcodes and street corners. The Zeb Khan network operated at the importation level, but remained fundamentally a Birmingham-based operation with Pakistan connections. Kavanagh was something different in nature, a senior figure in an internationally operating organised crime group who had chosen Birmingham and its surrounding area as his UK base, specifically because the Midlands offered the distribution infrastructure, the logistical connections, and the relative distance from the more surveilled environments of London that made it a viable operational centre for a major drug importation enterprise. His presence in Tamworth was not incidental to the city. It was a calculated choice made by a man who understood that the second city's criminal economy provided exactly the environment he needed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Next up, from the Handsworth cafes of the 1980s to the EncroChat messages of 2020, and examining what Birmingham's organised crime landscape looked like when all of its pieces are placed alongside each other. Section 10. Mohammed Imran Khan and the Oakwood Road Network. On the morning of the 22nd of May, 2021, 2 cars pulled up on Oakwood Road in Sparkhill, a residential street in South Birmingham, an Audi and a BMW. The men who got out were carrying machetes and a shotgun. They walked to a house, kicked the front door open, and went inside. Mohammed Ishaq was in that house. He was 32 years old, from Knoll Road in Sparkhill, and he had been preparing drugs for onward sale when the door came in. The men who entered attacked him with a machete. The wound to his arm was severe, a large slash that would leave lasting injury. The rival group then left as quickly as they had arrived, back into the cars and away down Oakwood Road before anyone could respond. Paramedics arrived in response to a call from the scene. When they saw what had happened inside the house, they reported it to police. That report was the beginning of an investigation that would eventually send 9 men to prison for a combined total of more than 77 years. The house on Oakwood Road was a drug preparation address, a location used by an organized group of men to process heroin and cocaine before moving it outward into the 6 separate drug lines they controlled across Birmingham. Processing drugs for street sale is not a discrete activity. It requires equipment, mixing agents, the product itself, and uninterrupted time. The choice of a residential house for this work was driven by the same logic that governs most middle-level drug operation decisions. A house looks like a house from the outside, does not attract the attention that an industrial or commercial premises might, and can be rented and vacated quickly if necessary. The Oakwood Roadhouse had been functioning as the network's preparation point until the 2 cars arrived and the door was kicked in. The men who carried out the attack were a rival group with their own interest in the drugs that were being prepared inside. They had not come simply to inflict violence. They had come to take what was in the house. When the attack on Ishaq drove them back out onto the street without the product, they faced a specific problem. The drugs they had come to steal were still inside, and the arrival of paramedics meant police would follow shortly. The window of time in which the contents of the house might still be recoverable was closing rapidly. The Oakwood Road gang faced the same calculation from the other direction. They knew police were coming. They had to move the drugs before officers arrived. What happened in the minutes between the rival group's departure and the arrival of West Midlands police was a rushed and increasingly desperate attempt to conceal the evidence of what the house had been used for. Members of the gang fled the address carrying the drugs. They moved toward the nearest available concealment point, which was Sparkhill Park, a few minutes away on foot. In the bushes along the park's edge, they pushed in a mixing bowl full of brown powder and several wrapped plastic bags. The total weight recovered from those bushes, when officers searched the area, was more than 8 kilograms of heroin and more than 1 kilogram of crack cocaine. The drugs found in the park had a street value, at the point of discovery, of approximately £22,000, but the eventual value after processing and sale would have been substantially higher. What happened next illustrated the level of desperation of both sides. The rival gang, the group that had carried out the attack and failed to retrieve the drugs, had not simply driven away from the scene. They had driven to Sparkhill Park. They were circling the park in an attempt to beat the police to the hidden stash, to recover what they had come for before officers found it. This produced an extraordinary sequence. 2 separate groups of men, one who had put the drugs in the bushes, and one who wanted to retrieve them, converging on the same park at the same time, while police were simultaneously responding to a call at the house on Oakwood Road. The rival group made one further decision that reflected the pressure they were under. One of them called 999. They reported a shooting incident at a location nearby, a false emergency designed to redirect police resources away from the park and toward a location where nothing had happened. The call was made, and the operators responded to it. Officers were diverted. For a brief period, the fake report achieved its intended effect. It did not achieve it for long enough. West Midlands police officers who arrived in the park area found the drugs before the rival group could retrieve them. The mixing bowl, the brown powder, the wrapped bags of crack cocaine, all of it was recovered from the bushes where it had been hidden. The investigation that West Midlands police launched in the immediate aftermath of May the 22nd would take 5 months to produce arrests and more than 3 years to produce convictions, but the evidence trail had begun on that morning in Sparkhill Park, buried in a bush by men running from their own drug house. Mohammed Imran Khan was 37 years old and lived on Imperial Road in Bawdsley Green. He was the leader of the network, a position established through the investigation's analysis of his phone data and his movements in the period immediately surrounding the attack. On the morning the rival group arrived at Oakwood Road, Khan had been driving others around in his BMW in the frantic attempt to recover the drugs before police secured the scene. His movements that morning were captured on CCTV. They placed him at the center of the group's response to the crisis, making decisions, directing others, trying to manage an emergency that had been created by a rival group's attack on his own operation. The detail that established Khan's leadership position most specifically was a physical object found during the subsequent investigation. He had produced a stamp, a custom-made marking device, that he used to print an advertisement for one of the gang's drug lines. The stamp carried a phone number and a set of opening hours, the times during which customers could call to place orders. A stamped marketing instrument for an illegal drug supply line, complete with business hours, was not the artifact of a disorganized or informal operation. It was the product of someone who thought about the drug business as a commercial enterprise with a customer base that needed to be informed of its service parameters. Khan had produced printed promotional material for a heroin and cocaine supply network operating out of South Birmingham. The network Khan ran was substantial in its reach. Investigators established that the group controlled at least 6 separate drug lines simultaneously, each phone number serving a distinct section of the customer base or geographic area. 6 lines is not an improvised operation. It requires management, coordination, a reliable supply chain, and a distribution workforce sufficient to service the volume of orders that multiple simultaneous lines generate. Drug lines of this structure function like a service business. They advertise availability through bulk messaging to known customers, take orders by phone, and dispatch product through a network of runners and dealers who make the deliveries. Khan's operation was running this model across at least 6 separate channels at once, which gave it a reach and resilience that a single line operation could not achieve. If one line was compromised, 5 others continued. If one runner was arrested, the remaining channels kept the business running. The investigation also documented 8 separate drug seizures connected to the network over an 18-month period between 2020 and 2021, a period covering the months before the Oakwood Road attack, as well as the day itself. 8 seizures across 18 months means that the operation was regularly losing product to police action in the ordinary course of its business, and continuing nonetheless. This is the normal pattern of a resilient drug supply network. Seizures are factored into the economics as a cost of doing business. If the volume of product moved across the period is large enough, the losses to seizure are affordable. Among the evidence recovered during the investigation was a photograph, found on a phone connected to the network, showing Mohammed Ishaq posing for a photograph with bowls of drugs. The same man who had been attacked with a machete in the Oakwood Roadhouse was documented celebrating his product. The photograph was not taken for external purposes. It was a private image, the kind of record that drug dealers sometimes make for their own satisfaction, a documentation of quantity and quality. As evidence in a criminal trial, it was precisely the kind of self-produced incrimination that phone-based investigations regularly uncover, placing the individual directly in contact with the substance in an unambiguous context. West Midlands police detectives conducted extensive CCTV analysis and mobile phone data work through the months following the May 2021 attack. Phone analysis traced the connections between 9 men, establishing who communicated with whom, when, and in what contexts. CCTV footage across Spark Hill and the surrounding areas documented movements and associations. The investigation built a comprehensive picture of the network's structure before presenting it to Crown Court. On the 20th of October 2021, officers executed a series of early morning raids across Birmingham, targeting the addresses of all 9 men simultaneously. All 9 were arrested. The 13-week trial at Birmingham Crown Court concluded in January 2025. All 9 men were convicted of conspiracy to supply heroin and cocaine. The sentencing took place in March 2025. Khan received 14 years and 2 months. Kaleem Ullah Khan, 37, of Arden Road in Saltley, had been seen leaving the Oakwood Road house after the machete attack, carrying a mixing bowl in a bin bag, managing the product even in the immediate chaotic aftermath of the assault. He received 13 years and 3 months. Mohammed Ishaq, the man who had been attacked in the house and who had posed for photographs with bowls of drugs, was sentenced to 10 years and 2 months. Sohail Hussain, 31, of Priory Gate Way in Bawdsley Green, had been observed leaving the house after the attack with a machete in one hand and a bag of cocaine in the other. A moment of operational clarity captured on footage that left little room for any alternative interpretation at trial. He received 9 years and 9 months. Riaz Mohammed, 39, of Carlton Road in Bawdsley Green, was sentenced to 7 years and 6 months. Anwar Awais, 28, of Allens Croft Road in Kings Heath, received 7 years and 4 months. The remaining defendants received sentences in the same range. What the Oakwood Road case illustrates, placed in the context of Birmingham's criminal history across the preceding 3 decades, is how the middle layer of the drug economy actually operated in the city by the early 2020s. Khan's network was not importing heroin from Pakistan. It was not running a cartel with a fortified mansion and international logistics. It was a mid-level operation processing product that arrived from above, running it through 6 lines to a customer base of individual users in South Birmingham, managing the commercial risks of that operation with marketing materials, structured lines, and the kind of operational continuity that absorbs losses to seizure and keeps running. The stamp Khan produced, with its phone number and its opening hours, is the clearest possible illustration of the commercial logic. A drug supply line is a business, its customers are a market, and they need to know when they can call. The investigation was only possible because a rival group decided to attack the Oakwood Road house with machetes and a shotgun on the morning of May the 22nd. Without the attack, without the paramedics seeing what had happened inside, without the subsequent police response and the discovery of the drugs in Sparkhill Park, the investigation might never have begun in the form it did. The rival group came to steal drugs and triggered the chain of events that put 9 men in front of a Crown Court jury. Their false 999 call, their circling of the park, their desperate attempt to recover what they had come for, all of it took place in the open, watched by CTV, and eventually documented by the investigators who used it as the foundation of a case. The criminal economy's internal violence, which had been generating its own investigations across Birmingham since the 1990s, had once again created the conditions for its own exposure. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.